When fans think of Japanese RPGs, some of the first titles that come to mind are big franchises like Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, games created by some of the biggest companies in the industry. However, before Yuji Horii made the first Dragon Quest, before Square was even founded, a small company was responsible for making some of the earliest role-playing games in Japan, a company that is still around to this day, called Nihon Falcom. In recent times, Falcom has become fairly well known in the West, with titles like Ys 8 and Trails of Cold Steel, but few people realize just how long the company has been around and how rich their history is. They are a small company that has quietly crafted many beloved RPG franchises since the beginning of the genre's existence in Japan. Despite their longevity, Falcom's titles have been localized sporadically throughout their life, with their games only getting regular releases in English over the past 10 years or so. Because of this, few Western fans have a full understanding of Falcom's history, with their start as an Apple retail store, to their rise to prominence during the mid-1980s, and their tumultuous period in the late 90s and early aughts. So today we are going to overview a side of the company that may be unknown to most modern fans. Today we are going to talk about the early history of Nihon Falcom, a history that spans almost 4 decades. Nihon Falcom was initially established on March 9, 1981, by a Japanese computer engineer named Masayuki Kato. Kato was born in 1946 and had spent most of his professional career in the automotive industry, working for Hino Motors throughout the 1970s. While at the company, Kato worked with general-purpose computers like the Textile machine to perform an early form of customer-to-customer network communication, among other responsibilities. After being at the company for many years, Kato was assigned to a position in Bangkok, Thailand, where he helped establish a new department for the company, an experience that would help him greatly when he started his own business. While working in Bangkok, Kato attended a convention where he had his first encounter with the Apple II personal computer. Compared to the primitive industrial computers he was used to working with, the Apple II's colored graphics and ease of use was a huge shock to Kato at the time. So, when he returned to Japan, he purchased his own Apple II computer and began programming simple games for his 5-year-old son by editing code for games that were written out in BASIC inside the pages of publications like ASCII magazine. This experience opened Kato's eyes to the huge potential of the burgeoning personal computer market and the joy of creating video games. So, feeling restricted at Hino Motors after returning from Thailand, Kato left his job of 12 years to establish his own company, where he hoped to open a computer shop and potentially publish his own software in the future. And so, Nihon Falcom was founded. The company's name actually comes from the classic sci-fi film Star Wars, which had premiered in Japan with a Japanese dub just 2 years earlier in 1979. Kato was a fan of Han Solo's iconic spaceship, the Millennium Falcon, so he added the suffix "com" to the end of Falcon to make it sound more like an electronics company. Then he added Nihon, the Japanese word for Japan, to the front of the name to make it sound more complete. However, when Kato first founded his company, he lacked the capital to open a computer shop. So before Falcom did anything with video games or selling computers, its first job was assisting other companies with business analysis and planning, with Falcom helping JICA, the Japan International Corporation Agency, with creating a computer-based transportation economic simulation for a project in northern Thailand. Using the money he obtained from this job, Kato finally opened his first store in July 1981, called Computerland Tachigawa. The store sold Apple computers and software, among other goods, and was a very casual mom-and-pop style store, with Kato and his wife being the only full-time employees. Computer sales were often slow, since PCs were very expensive at the time, but what attracted people to Kato's shop was how he created a space where customers could sample the computers in the store. Patrons were allowed to freely work on different machines set up in the shop, and Kato even gave away free coffee to customers and had sofas set up for people to relax on. Because of this hangout atmosphere at the shop, Computerland soon attracted various hobbyist programmers. One of these people was a young man named Yoshio Kiya, who had begun programming in his spare time after purchasing an NEC PC6001. He would often visit the shop with oil-stained hands due to his day job as a car mechanic, and would sometimes barter software he created to purchase computer hardware at the store. This eventually led to Kiya creating a video game in 1982 using a Casio FP1100 computer that had been lent to him by Computerland. The game impressed Masayuki Kato enough that he worked with Kiya to publish the game and sell it at Computerland, with Kiya bartering the software for a new printer. The game was a basic sci-fi strategy title called Galactic Wars 1 that proudly proclaimed on its box that it was a fantasy simulation war game for people with brains who are afraid to use them. The title was published in limited quantities sometime around June or December of 1982, with every copy being assembled by hand only when a customer placed an order for the game. Even the box art was an illustration created by Kato's brother, which he simply repurposed for Galactic Wars' cover. This humble release would mark Falcom's first step into the Japanese PC game industry, and would begin Kato's working relationship with Yoshio Kiya, who would eventually be known as one of Falcom's top creatives and a star programmer. The following year, Falcom would begin publishing software in earnest by releasing a hodgepodge of different applications in a variety of genres across multiple computer platforms. This included everything from a Japanese word processor for the Fujitsu Micro 8 to an erotic sliding puzzle game for the NEC PC88, which was advertised as one of Falcom's best sellers at the time. They released more traditional games as well, including single-screen action games like Birdland and a golf simulation named Computer the Golf, among many others. Falcom was basically publishing at least one title in every genre to see what would stick, and they were not developing any of these games themselves, with every title being made by regulars at Computerland who sold their software to Falcom. During this year of experimentation, Falcom would also publish a primordial example of a role-playing game that was created by Yoshio Kiya called Panorama Toe. While clearly inspired by early Western RPGs like Ultima, the game did not contain many staples of the RPG genre, such as stats and the ability to level up, and was more of a hybrid of various gameplay styles. Despite this, the title is still considered to be one of the earliest examples of a Japanese-developed role-playing game, along with titles like Dragon and Princess and The Black Onyx. With the sales of their games increasing, Falcom began hiring staff the following year to make games themselves instead of relying solely on hobbyists, with Yoshio Kiya joining the company in June 1984. Falcom was beginning to take game development seriously and would release 2 important titles this year. During this time, the graphical adventure genre was going through a boom period on Japanese computers due to the huge success of Microcabin's Mystery House series in 1982, unrelated to Online Systems Mystery House from 1980. Following this trend, Falcom had already released several graphical adventure games, but 1984's Demon's Ring would be the company's first truly landmark entry in this growing genre. Besides the game being Falcom's first fully colored adventure game, Demon's Rings was technically impressive for its time since the game could quickly load new images within seconds. This was a huge improvement over similar titles, which had to slowly draw each new scene line by line. Demon's Rings was an early example of Falcom's technical know-how, and is often considered to be the first real video game to be released by the company, with the product being the first title to appear on many of Falcom's official corporate timelines. However, Falcom's release at the very end of the year would be a new type of real-time role-playing game, created by Yoshio Kiya, that in many ways defined Falcom's identity as a company. That game was Falcom's second role-playing game, a title called Dragon Slayer. The game was a role-playing action crossover that is often considered by many sources to be one of the first Japanese-produced action RPGs. The title would also be the beginning of Falcom's storied Dragon Slayer franchise, a family of loosely connected RPGs that often differed greatly in terms of gameplay, but were all designed by Yoshio Kiya. This simple, puzzle-esque role-playing game would progenerate several sub-series that are still continuing to this day and remain as some of Falcom's most iconic titles. The first 4 years of Falcom's history would see them establish themselves after much experimentation, but it wasn't until 1985 that the studio would release their first blockbuster success, a title that would change Falcom and even the Japanese game industry forever. After releasing Azteca in April 1985, another adventure game in a similar vein to Demon's Ring, Falcom would publish the second entry in the Dragon Slayer franchise on October 27th, called Xanadu: Dragon Slayer 2. Xanadu was a side-scrolling action RPG where combat played out on a separate screen that was in an overhead perspective similar to its predecessor. The game was very difficult, so difficult that few people even managed to finish it, with Falcom handing out special cards to players that were able to conquer Xanadu's challenges. However, despite its difficulty, Xanadu became a runaway success. The game's vast world and satisfying gameplay resonated with Japanese PC players of the time, and would go on to sell 400,000 copies, a record-breaking number that was unheard of for its time. To put it in perspective, only 2 years earlier in 1983, Falcom stated in an advertisement for Galactic Wars 1 that the game was a huge success, and that their goal was to sell 10,000 copies. Compared to these numbers, Xanadu was on a different planet in terms of sales, and it ranked as one of the all-time best-selling Japanese PC games for decades. Kato even stated in a later interview that if you included pirated copies, pretty much anyone in Japan that owned a computer at the time had played Xanadu in some form. While Dragon Slayer was an early example of an action RPG, it was Xanadu that helped popularize the genre in Japan, and was one of the first uniquely Japanese RPGs that had its own identity compared to the many imitations of Western RPGs that were flooding the market at the time. Xanadu was the title that transformed Falcom from a humble developer into one of the leaders of the Japanese PC game industry. Following Xanadu's success, a golden age for the company would begin, where Falcom would establish several classic franchises and successful sequels, along with a new merchandising strategy. Masayuki Kato's dream as a businessman was to create a product similar to Hello Kitty, a cute character who could be merchandised to sell various goods. While that may seem unrelated to the game software he was making now, he still took the philosophy behind Hello Kitty and used it to turn Xanadu into a sellable icon. Kato even took special care when designing the game's logo during development, with the hope of placing the logo on merchandise in the future. And once the game was a success, Falcom wasted no time slapping that logo on Xanadu branded goods to sell to fans. They made Xanadu t-shirts, published Xanadu books, created a Xanadu manga, released a Xanadu board game. Magazines and catalogs were full of ads featuring a model named Amanda Jane posing next to Xanadu merch. The Japanese metal band Anthem even composed a single called Xanadu to promote the game. Falcom was riding the wave of Xanadu's success, and they were ready to bring their hit game to the United States through a partnership with Origin Systems, the creators of the hugely influential Ultima series. Sadly, the deal ended up falling through due to legal issues, but Xanadu's success had made Falcom big enough that they were able to almost court a big Western company like Origin. Unsurprisingly, a follow-up to Xanadu was quickly produced, with Xanadu Scenario 2 releasing a year after the original in October 1986. The sequel was an early example of an expansion pack, with it requiring the original Xanadu in order to run. Not only did it contain new levels and challenges, but it also featured a new soundtrack composed by Takahito Abe and the famed Yuzo Koshiro. Koshiro, a composer who would later become world famous for his many game compositions, applied for a position at Falcom using a demo tape of music he had created on his PC-88 over his summer break. Falcom liked his music so much that he was hired, and the songs from his tape were repurposed for Xanadu 2, debuting Koshiro's music career. In many ways, Koshiro's arrival at the company marked the beginning of Falcom placing a lot more importance on developing their soundtracks, with the company's music eventually becoming one of the major selling points of their games. The rest of October 1986 was packed with several other Falcom titles, including the next Dragon Slayer title. an action game called Romancia that was infamous, like Xanadu, for its brutal difficulty, which contrasted harshly with its cutesy presentation. Additionally, a sequel to Aztecia was produced that featured more RPG elements compared to its predecessor, an example of how all of Falcom's games were becoming some kind of role-playing experience after the success of Xanadu. The following year, 1987, would be similarly packed for Falcom, with the company releasing one of their most iconic titles. Designed by Masaya Hashimoto, a programmer who previously worked on the Azteca series, and featuring a story by Tomoyoshi Miyazaki, Ys was a simple overhead action RPG that was the start of one of Falcom's most beloved and long-running franchises. The title was created as a response to the ever-growing complexity of PC RPGs, so it featured straightforward bump-style combat that was easy to understand and nowhere near as difficult as titles like Romancia or Xanadu. One of the game's ads even famously declared that RPGs had now entered the age of kindness. Its accessibility, coupled with the classic soundtrack composed by Yuzo Koshiro and the newly hired Meiko Ishikawa, Ys proved to be hugely popular and was ported numerous times to various consoles and PC platforms. Ys would even become the first internationally released Falcom game, with Sega releasing their Master System port in the United States the following year in 1988. The title's success is all the more impressive knowing that a lot of its development staff was very young at the time, with Tomoyoshi only working part-time at Falcom while he was still a college student. Yuzo Koshiro was only 19, and his sister, Ayano Koshiro, who joined the company shortly after her brother, was only 17 when she worked on Ys as a graphic designer. Along with this milestone in Falcom's history, Yoshio Kiya would also create the next two installments in his Dragon Slayer series in 1987, beginning with the Duracell family in July and ending with Sosarian in December. The Duracell family, also known as Legacy of the Wizard, was a Metroid-esque side-scrolling action title that was notable for being the first console game developed by Falcom themselves. Falcom had begun working with third-party developers to create console ports for their PC games, and even worked with other third parties to create original console titles, such as Hudson Soft's Xanadu spin-off on the Famicom called Fazanadu. However, Falcom remained a dedicated PC developer despite the popularity of home consoles, due to the company having more control over their products on the PC by not having to pay first-party licensing fees or deal with expensive cartridge production. The Duracell family was Falcom's first console title, and was created thanks to a deal Masayuki Kato made with Namco, who published the Famicom version almost simultaneously with the MSX computer version. While the company dipped its toe into console development, it ended up being a one-time affair, since Falcom would return to the PC-88 with the release of the fifth Dragon Slayer game, Sosarian. The title was a party-based action RPG that contained 15 different scenarios that the player could experience, almost like 15 mini-adventures in one game. Similar to Xanadu Scenario 2, Sosarian featured a modular design that could be easily expanded, with Falcom adding more content to the game through the release of different scenario packs. The game was so popular that not only did Falcom release several scenario packs, but other companies also created their own third-party expansions. On top of all this content, Sosarian also contained a beefy soundtrack, composed by Yuzo Koshiro and Meiko Ishikawa, with Koshiro creating 39 of the game's 60 tracks, a huge soundtrack for the time.
第2位です。
ソーサリアン。
それではロビンの選んだ第1位は
Ys 2ですね。
Falcom was releasing success after success. Soon a direct sequel to Ys was released. Various scenario packs for Sosarian were created, and an original shooter crossed with an RPG called Star Trader was published. Falcom was at the top of the world, and at one point, the top 4 best-selling Japanese PC games were all Falcom titles. However, they were not satisfied with just making games anymore. Falcom wanted their properties to expand into other mediums and industries. The character Lilia from Ys 2 had become quite popular, in no small part to her striking first appearance in the game, with a smoothly animated head turn and a full-screen graphic of her face looking at the player. This character's popularity opened Falcom's eyes to more merchandising opportunities, beyond even what they did with Xanadu. So the company started placing their characters front and center in their advertisements, and began adapting their stories into other media to capitalize on their popularity. Tons of products based on Falcom franchises started to be produced, such as novels, manga, figures, stamps, and many other items. To help sell all this merchandise, a store solely dedicated to selling Falcom products, aptly named Falcom Shop, opened its doors on November 3rd, 1989. On top of all this, Falcom even began funding various direct-to-video anime adaptations of their different franchises, starting with Toei Animation's Xanadu Dragon Slayer Densetsu in 1988, followed shortly after by Ys in 1989. At the forefront of Falcom's new mixed media campaign was the company's music. Their soundtracks had become so famous for their quality that they began selling albums in the mid-1980s. This even led to Falcom founding their own music label, with a partnership between them and King Records called Falcom Label, which would sell a number of arranged albums such as the Falcom Special Box Series and Perfect Collections. Meiko Ishikawa, the co-creator of the Ys soundtrack, would go on to establish a new in-house sound team in late 1988, known initially as JDK, later renamed to Falcom Sound Team JDK. They made their debut composing the soundtrack for Star Trader, and would go on to compose all of Falcom's future music. The sound team even had their own band that performed live concerts. Falcom was blowing up, and their brands were beginning to expand outside of gaming. However, amidst all this success, 1988 through 1990 would also mark Falcom's first huge brain drain of talent, a mass exodus of developers that would cripple the company. The brain drain began in 1988 when Yuzo Koshiro left the company along with his sister to become a freelance composer, with the two eventually forming their own company called Ancient in 1990. While it is not completely clear why Yuzo left, it seems that he was unhappy with how Falcom handled his music in regards to copyright and the arrangements of his songs done by other composers. The next year, Falcom would lose even more Ys staff, with both Masaya Hashimoto and Tomoyoshi Miyazaki leaving the company after development had finished on Ys 3 Wanderers from Ys in 1989. Ys 3 had gameplay that was very different from the previous entry, being a side-scrolling affair similar to Adventures of Link, and that is because it was not initially meant to be a Ys game at all. The game began as an original title unrelated to Ys, but over time it was decided by management that the game should be a spin-off to the franchise called Wanderers from Ys, with a true third entry potentially planned to be made at a later date. However, at the very last minute, the game was changed to be a numbered sequel. Perhaps because of this sudden change, Hashimoto and Tomoyoshi both quit and co-founded Quintet in April 1989, where they would become famous for their many action RPGs they developed on the Super Famicom of Enix. The departures did not end there, however. Graphic artist Tomo Yamane, a veteran pixel artist that created the graphic for Lilia that made her so popular, left the company in 1989 because he didn't feel valued enough. Even Ys's map designers, Yoshihiko Kurata and Seijo Okitane, both left the company at the same time. The only person that worked on the original Ys that didn't leave during this time was Meiko Ishikawa, who remains at Falcom to this day as one of the managing directors at the company. During the late 1980s, Falcom was basically split up into 3 development teams, with 3 key staff members spearheading each team. These were Yoshio Kiya leading the Dragon Slayer titles, Masaya Hashimoto, who was responsible for Ys, and Kazunari Tomi, a programmer in charge of Star Trader. With all these recent departures, Falcom had basically lost its entire Ys development team, and another team would follow shortly after. Falcom would release a first-person dungeon crawler named Dinosaur in 1990, which was designed, written, and programmed by Kazunori Tomy. However, during the game's development, Tomy left the company to form Studio Alex, the studio that would later create the Lunar franchise. Another notable employee that left Falcom the same year was Tetsuya Takahashi, a graphic artist who had done a lot of work crafting the world for Dinosaur. He would leave to join Square, where he would eventually develop Xenogears, before founding Monolith Soft in the 2000s, where he currently heads the Xenoblade series. And these are just some of the most famous departures from this period. Falcom was hemorrhaging employees as one person after the other left the company. Once the smoke had cleared from all these departures, Yoshio Kiya's team was basically all that remained at Falcom. During all this turmoil, Kiya continued to guide the ship through this uncertain storm with the next seminal entry in the Dragon Slayer family in December 1989. Taking inspiration from the ever-popular Dragon Quest series on consoles, Dragon Slayer The Legend of Heroes was Falcom's attempt at making their own turn-based RPG on the PC. While the gameplay was very standard for the genre, the well-told story and memorable characters drew players in at the time. Eventually, this singular title would grow into a franchise of its own and become one of Falcom's most beloved IPs, eventually becoming bigger than the entire Dragon Slayer brand. However, that was a ways off from now. It was a bright future that seemed even further away during the dark times Falcom now found themselves in. The past 5 years had been Falcom's salad days, with the company growing substantially and their properties expanding into other media. However, Falcom was growing very quickly, and Masayuki Kaito's conservative management style felt limiting to many of their staff, who wanted to break out into bigger things and make more console titles. While the staff was often getting a lot of recognition for their work, often being interviewed in magazines and even on television, they also seemed to have little control over their creations, with Falcom's management often going against the will of the developers, such as the case with Ys 3. So since many of these developers had become famous in their own right, they left the company in droves to places where they felt more respected, or to found their own companies. Perhaps this is one of the reasons modern-day Falcom heavily restricts how much exposure their employees get, with the company's president being the only person to be interviewed by the media, and how even the game's credits are often very vague, with it being almost impossible to tell who exactly created what in each game. Back in 1990, Falcom was heading towards the beginning of a new decade. Just like every developer during this era, they would have to face the challenge of evolving in the ever-growing game industry, but now with most of their development staff gone. Falcom would have to go through a lot of changes if they were going to survive the 90s. "1991 would be a year of celebration. It was Nihon Falcom's 10th anniversary, and they would mark the occasion with yet another Dragon Slayer title, a real-time strategy game known as Lord Monarch. The title was released on March 21st, 1991, almost exactly 10 years to the day that Masayuki Kaito first established Falcom. However, while everything seemed great on the outside, Falcom would go through many changes internally over the ensuing 5 years. Falcom was still steadily producing games despite their loss in staff, including 2 new IPs in 1991 alone, those being a hardcore dungeon crawler named Brandish and a comedic action game called Potful Mail. Additionally, they were even advertising that big sequels like Xanadu 3 and Ys 4 were currently in development. However, the total number of games Falcom was releasing began to decrease due to their staff issues, as well as their developers transitioning from 8-bit computers like the NEC PC-88 to the 16-bit PC-98. In an attempt to bolster their development efforts, Falcom would obtain some outside help. During their 10th anniversary celebrations, Falcom would establish a new partnership with the House of the Blue Needle Mouse. Sega! In a highly advertised announcement, the two developers revealed the formation of a new hybrid studio called Sega Falcom. Sega had previously worked with Falcom to create console ports for their titles, such as the aforementioned Master System version of Ys 1 and a Mega Drive port of Sosarian. But this new studio would have the two companies work together directly to create games for Sega's upcoming CD-ROM attachment, the Mega CD. These included enhanced ports of Popful Mail, Brandish, Lord Monarch, the third entry in a strategy simulation series called Daisen Raku, and the upcoming fourth installment in the Ys franchise. Sadly, this partnership didn't bear any fruit until 1994, and even then, the Mega CD version of Popful Mail would be the only title out of the 5 initially announced to make it to market, a game that would later be localized into English by Working Designs. All the other games by Sega Falcom would be cartridge releases, but after the Mega Drive port of The Legend of Heroes 2 was published in 1995, the partnership between the two companies would dissolve, and they would never work together again. While Ys 4 never made it to the Mega CD, Falcom did work with several other development studios to create the fourth entry in the Ys series. Due to all the Ys staff leaving in '89, and the rest of the company being busy with other projects, Falcom only made a design document for Ys 4. They outlined the game's world and composed the music, while third-party studios developed the game itself. The first developer to approach Falcom with the idea of making a Ys 4 was actually Hudson Soft, who wanted to make a sequel after finding success with their release of Ys Books 1 and 2 on the PC Engine CD, a title that introduced many Western fans to the series due to it releasing in the States on the TurboGrafx CD in 1990. However, while Falcom made a deal with Hudson to make a fourth Ys title, they also teamed up with Tonkin House to create a version of Ys 4 for the Super Famicom, the same company that also brought Ys 3 to the platform. So, following Falcom's design document, 2 different versions of Ys 4 were released in 1993, those being Mask of the Sun for the Super Famicom and Dawn of Ys for the PC Engine CD. While different slightly in terms of story and presentation, both games returned to the bump-style combat from the first 2 entries, since 3's change in gameplay was somewhat controversial with fans. So while 2 versions of Ys 4 were made, Falcom never directly created a version of the game themselves, a fact that would not change until the company remade Ys 4 almost 2 decades later. Meanwhile, Falcom would continue to create new entries in the Brandish franchise on the PC-98, while simultaneously throwing their hat once again into making console games, with a new title developed internally at Falcom. That title would be 1994's The Legend of Xanadu, also known in Japanese as Legend of the Wind Xanadu. Developed for the PC Engine CD, this top-down action RPG marked the return of the Xanadu series 8 years after the release of Scenario 2. Although the game was not quite the Xanadu 3 the company had initially advertised, being more of a spin-off rather than a numbered sequel, The Legend of Xanadu would serve as the 8th game in the Dragon Slayer series, and was notable for being the first game Falcom released exclusively for a home console, with the game not receiving a PC port in Japan. The title was heavily advertised, even getting its own television commercial, and was a very highly regarded RPG on the PC Engine, with fans considering it to be an accumulation of Falcom's best qualities from their different franchises, featuring Ys-like action combat mixed with the storytelling style of The Legend of Heroes. Unfortunately, The Legend of Xanadu would also be infamous for being the last game designed by Yoshio Kiya at Falcom. Kiya, who had been with the company almost since the beginning and created many of Falcom's classic titles, left the company in 1993 before The Legend of Xanadu was even finished. He believed that Falcom should transition to developing for MS-DOS and Windows-based computers, instead of continuing to make games for the PC-88 and 98. However, when he approached Masayuki Kato about this, he was told that his idea would kill the company, and that they would not change course. Frustrated by this decision, Kiya left the company to join Nihon Application, an information technology company where he would direct the Gekirin series for a few years before becoming a CTO at the company. Kiya was the last of Falcom's old guard, and his departure signaled the end of an era for the company, truly closing the book on Falcom's golden age. With all of their key staff from their original development teams now gone, Nihon Falcom's output shrunk further, and the company began focusing on developing their existing franchises instead of creating brand new titles. The company also began to desperately look for new staff to fill in the gaps left by all these departures. Falcom recruitment ads began to be published all over the pages of popular magazines, and even within the ads of their own games, which often contained staff testimonials speaking about how great it was to work at Falcom. 1994 would come to a close with 2 sequels, Brandish's 3rd installment, and a new entry in the Legend of Heroes series. Around this time, many RPG developers were growing greatly in size in order to increase the production value of their titles, adding cinematic cutscenes and lavish graphical presentations. Falcom was finding it harder and harder to keep up with these studios due to their loss in staff, so instead of trying to compete head-on, Falcom decided that they should focus their efforts instead on text. Kato's thinking was that if you wanted to tell a good story, you only really needed a single talented writer to produce interesting prose. Text was cheap, and if used properly, it could be just as effective in conveying a game narrative as expensive graphics and cutscenes. So with The Legend of Heroes 3, subtitled as The White Witch, Kato gave writer Tadashi Hayakawa the responsibility of creating a rich narrative for the series' next installment. Hayakawa had previously been a screenplay writer in the anime industry, but ended up joining Falcom after penning the scripts for the Ys anime OVAs, where he had since been writing for the Brandish series, even writing a novel based off the Brandish franchise. This new entry in the Legend of Heroes series penned by Hayakawa would turn out to be a milestone release that was praised for its lush story full of small details. Early advertisements for The White Witch even boasted about how much text was in the game, with the script for the game's first chapter being larger than the entirety of the original Legend of Heroes. The White Witch would become a fan favorite, and go on to become a bestseller, where it was eventually ported to other systems by third parties. Not only that, but the game would spawn 2 sequels that would collectively be known as the Gaghoff trilogy. Each entry in the trilogy focused on a different region, where the player could experience firsthand the perspective of its people during different periods of time. This ambitious, interconnected series of games would flesh out the Legend of Heroes into its own franchise, separate from Dragon Slayer, and would become one of Falcom's most treasured classics, a bright point amidst Falcom's troubles with retaining development staff. Back in the world of television, Falcom continued to try their hand at home console development by branching out to the Super Famicom. By far the most popular platform in the market, the company made their way back to Nintendo 7 years after the release of the Drassel family, by porting Popful Mail to the system in 1994. However, they didn't abandon the PC Engine. The Legend of Xanadu 2 was released in 1995, and labeled itself as the last game in the storied Dragon Slayer franchise, although it is often not considered to be the true final entry due to Yoshi Okiya not being involved with its development. 1995 would also see the release of the 5th Ys game for the Super Famicom in December, with development moving back to Falcom after multiple studios had worked on 4. Falcom used the skills they had learned developing Popful Mail for the system to create the 5th entry in their popular series, which marked yet another huge shift in gameplay. Ys 5 allowed for more direct control over combat, instead of having simple bump-style action, but retained its more classic overhead perspective, unlike Ys 3. However, due to its slow gameplay, stiff controls, and late release on the Super Famicom, Ys 5 was not very successful, and is often considered by fans to be one of the weaker entries in the series. This release would in some ways signal the beginning of a slow period for the company. It seemed that all of Falcom's troubles had finally begun to catch up with them, and even though they had continued to release quality games, they ended up falling into a creative slump for the next few years.
戦兵器エヴァンゲリオンが14歳の少年を乗せ今出撃する。人々はその先に何を見るのか。
The year is 1996. The classic mecha anime Evangelion is airing on Japanese television, and just as Shinji Ikari is having some bad days in the show, so too is Falcom entering a rough time for their company. Ultimately, Falcom didn't find that much profitability in the console space. The PC Engine was nearing the end of its life, with The Legend of Xanadu 2 releasing with far less fanfare than the previous game, and Ys 5 failed to find a large audience. So, Falcom withdrew back to the PC market. Tadashi Hayakawa continued to truck along at the company with new entries in the Gaghoff trilogy and the Brandish franchise. In fact, the fourth Brandish title in 1996, Brandish VT, would end up being Falcom's last game released for the PC-98 before the company transitioned to Windows-based computers, only a few years after Kia had initially recommended they do so. Outside of these sequels, the studio would enter what Masayuki Kato would later call a remake period, where Falcom almost exclusively published ports and remakes. Falcom had taken in a lot of new staff in the mid-90s. So, to ensure profitability and to help train their younger employees, Kato had the company make remakes of their classic titles, beginning with releases like Xanadu Revival in 1995. The only original title released during this entire period would be Vantage Master in 1997, a hexagon-based strategy game, while everything else was slightly altered versions of titles from Falcom's back catalog. A brand new Ys game would not be released for quite a while, with the company instead focusing on developing reimaginings of the first two Ys games, known as Ys Eternal in 1998 and Ys 2 Eternal in 2000. In an attempt to diversify their lineup, Falcom also began localizing various Korean and Chinese RPGs for the Japanese PC market, starting with the Rhapsody of Zephyr in 1999, eventually leading to many other localizations in the new millennium. The decade would come to an end with the final entry in the Gaghoff trilogy in 1999, Cage Song of the Ocean, which would also be Tadashi Hayakawa's final writing credit at Falcom before he left the company to return to the anime industry. Hayakawa was actually one of several people that left Falcom around this time, beginning the company's second exodus of developers. Although the brain drain was not as severe as Falcom's previous exodus, it still saw many senior employees depart from the company. It seems there was a lot of drama surrounding the development of Cage Song, which caused Hayakawa to leave the project after only writing half of the story. Another person that fled the company was Katsumi Togashi, a longtime producer at Falcom that left with several members of the Legend of Heroes development team to form a studio called Gruppo 1 in 2000. One of the main artists for both the Ys and Legend of Heroes series, Minako Iwasaki, also left Falcom to become a freelance illustrator. She initially joined the company in 1993 because she was such a huge fan of the Ys franchise, with her fan art being found within the pages of several gaming magazines in the 80s and 90s. She quickly became one of the main illustrators for Ys 5 and The Legend of Heroes 3, but after leaving the company, she did various jobs for a variety of studios, including designing characters for many Gruppo 1 titles, and eventually becoming famous for her designs in the Rune Factory series. While Falcom's second decade would see yet more staff leave the company, Falcom also hired a few interesting people in the late 90s. Some of the most notable additions to Falcom staff include Makoto Shinkai in 1996 and Toshihiro Kondo in 1998. Shinkai was a graphical artist that also helped with publicity and documentation for various Falcom games, getting his start designing graphics for titles like Lord Monarch Original and the Windows port of The Legend of Heroes 3. His signature style of detailed landscapes surrounded by billowing clouds and warm lighting is most apparent in the opening animations he helped create, and the graphical style of titles like Zwei, a forthcoming Falcom title. While Shinkai's art style would leave an indelible mark on Falcom, with some of his visual flourishes still appearing in modern titles, perhaps his biggest contribution to Falcom's image as a company is the iconic logo animation he created that still plays at the beginning of many Falcom games and trailers. After leaving the company in the early 2000s, Shinkai would rise up from his humble beginnings at Falcom to become a world-famous film director, where he would go on to make a name for himself with movies like 5 centimeters per second and Your Name.
こんにちは、日本ファルコムの近藤です。
The other employee, Toshihiro Kondo, would have a huge impact on the company going forward. Kondo was a longtime Falcom fan that had created fan sites as a hobby during his days as a college student, including creating a site for his favorite Falcom game, The Legend of Heroes 3. His site for the game became so popular that Falcom was already aware of his work when he later applied for a position at the company in 1998, which got him hired as a network engineer. He started out making promotional sites for Falcom's games, but over time he would become more and more directly involved with the games themselves, eventually leading to him writing extra scenarios for the PC ports of the Gaghoff series, and even finishing the story for Cage Song after Hayakawa's departure. As time went on, Kondo would become a key figure that would help to usher in the next age for Falcom, a new age that saw the company get out of the slump it had been in for the past few years. The next decade would be a second wind of sorts for Nihon Falcom. In terms of organization, Falcom would split its game development team off into its own division in November of 2001 that was separate from the licensing and investment businesses. Shinji Yamazaki was appointed as the new president of the company, and Masayuki Kato stepped down to become a chairman and advisor. Along with this new management, the company also entered the Japanese stock market in 2003 and became a publicly traded company in December of that year. Falcom was evolving, and the company's newly independent game division would see the young staff that had sharpened their skills on remakes and ports come into their own, creating the next generation of Falcom games. In 2001, the development division would create the company's first new IP in several years, with a previously mentioned top-down action-adventure game called Zwei in December. 2002 would mainly see Falcom release various ports and re-releases, but at the end of the year, a longtime programmer at the company named Takayuki Kusano would make his directorial debut with Dinosaur Resurrection, a remake of 1990's Dinosaur. Kusano had worked at the company since the early 1990s, where he assisted with programming on titles like Brandish 2 and The Legend of Heroes 5. But during this new millennium, he would start to become one of Falcom's most important game directors, eventually becoming one of the managers of the whole company. In fact, the next year, Kusano would direct Falcom's first new Ys title in almost a decade. After finishing Ys 2 Eternal in 2000, the development team was told to remake Ys 3 as well, but the team pushed back, believing that they now had the skills to take on a new numbered entry. Thus, Ys 6, The Ark of Nepishtim was released in September 2003, almost 8 years since the 5th game released for consoles, and a staggering 14 since the last entry was released on the PC. The title further evolved the core gameplay from Ys 5, while polishing its controls and changing its presentation to a mixture of 3D backgrounds and pre-rendered characters. The title reinvented the Ys franchise once again, and saw Falcom's young staff revitalize the series with new life after it had been dormant for a long time. Just the same, The Legend of Heroes Trails in the Sky similarly propelled its franchise into a new direction in 2004. After the end of the Gaghoff trilogy, much of the senior staff that had worked on the previous Legend of Heroes games had left the company. This meant that Trails in the Sky would be the first game in the series where the young staff would lead all aspects of development, with Toshihiro Kondo writing the game's story from the beginning instead of adding on to other creators' works. Because its staff was so young, the game went through a protracted development cycle, with the title being forced to release basically half-finished after 3 years of work. However, despite Trails in the Sky's sudden cliffhanger ending, or perhaps because of it, the game was critically well received and would spawn a slew of interconnected sequels. While the Gaghoff trilogy explored its world over the course of 3 games, Trails' story expanded its scope, where it would have its own duologies that focused on different regions and groups of characters within a larger continent, with all of its entries adding to an overall narrative that connected them all, basically becoming the video game equivalent of a cinematic universe. Over time, the Trails series would become Falcom's most popular IP, spawning its own interconnected story arcs and spin-offs that grew to be much larger than any other Falcom franchise. Falcom had regained its steam, and was moving right along with new IPs like Guruman, a cutesy action platformer released in December 2004. Without skipping a beat, the next year Falcom would refine their new formula for the Ys series with Oath and Felghana, a completely redesigned remake of Ys 3, and they would publish a new entry in the Xanadu franchise, with Xanadu Next, the series' first new entry since The Legend of Xanadu 2 10 years prior. One after the other, Falcom was pumping out highly regarded games that are still loved by fans to this day. The past 5 years marked a sort of rebirth for Falcom as a developer. The titles being created by the new game division signified Falcom re-establishing themselves, with the new staff members coming into their own and making the next big installments in Falcom's storied franchises, injecting new life into the company and their properties. This was a positive trend for Falcom, but the company would soon arrive at an important crossroad that would forever change the studio, forming them into the developer they are known as today. Since the release of Ys 5 on the Super Famicom in 1995, Falcom had focused purely on developing for the PC, with all of their console ports being handled by third parties like Taito, Konami, and others. However, the PC market in Japan had begun to shrink dramatically over the past few years. At that time, every major Japanese developer had left the PC behind and was focusing exclusively on home console development. Some of the only Japanese games that could make a profit on the PC were MMOs or other online-focused titles. So Falcom's president, Shinji Yamazaki, decided that the company should begin to explore more profitable platforms where they could release their titles. Due to its portable nature and graphical capabilities, the company decided to try releasing some of their pre-existing titles on the PlayStation Portable, starting with a port of Gurumin in 2006. While continuing to develop games for the PC, such as Trails in the Sky Second Chapter and Ys Origins, Falcom continued to bring titles to the PSP, with Trails in the Sky First Chapter being their second game ported to the platform. Additionally, Falcom also tried to branch out by licensing their properties to other developers to create MMOs based on their franchises. This initiative actually began around 2003, when the company announced that they would develop Ys Online with CJ Internet, although it would not actually launch until more around 2007. Ys Online's release would also lead to the beginning of other MMO projects, including Zwei Online, Sosarian Online, and Gurumin Online, although the last title would end up being cancelled. Sosarian Online was especially interesting since Yoshio Kiya actually worked on the title as an advisor, since Creamsmar, the current name of Nihon Application, helped create the title. While all this was going on, 2007 would see Falcom go through yet another big change in management, with Toshihiro Kondo succeeding Shinji Yamazaki as Nihon Falcom's president. Over the past few years, Kondo had become more and more involved with game development at Falcom, with him becoming a project manager after the release of Trails in the Sky, and eventually becoming the appointed head of the Planning and Development Committee. After Yamazaki decided to step down due to health reasons in July 2007, Masayuki Kato was forced to find someone to replace him. While Yamazaki knew how to run a business, he was not actually that technically minded. However, Kondo was someone that understood every aspect of the company, from selling the games to directly making them. Because he had a strong grasp on all aspects of the business, Kato asked Kondo if he would like to become the next president, in a very casual meeting where he simply asked Kondo if he wanted the position, and he accepted. Kondo was only in his early 30s at the time, but despite his young age, his presidency at the company would mark the beginning of a new era for Falcom, as he led the company in a new direction. Sales of Falcom's PSP projects were not very promising at first, with Gurumin and Trails only selling about 20,000 copies on the platform. However, the company continued advertising their PSP titles a full year after they were released. Eventually, their efforts paid off when Sony released the PSP 2000 in 2007. Thanks to positive word of mouth and the influx of new PSP users thanks to the 2000 launch, sales began to pick up. Trails in the Sky First Chapter and the newly released Second Chapter began to sell rapidly on the PSP, with First Chapter selling over 100,000 copies. These sales numbers helped convince Falcom that the platform was a good fit for their titles, and a large majority of people who were buying their PSP games had never played a Falcom game before, which helped grow the company's fanbase substantially. This newfound success on the PSP would turn out to be a godsend, because at the same time, PC sales began to take a sharp nosedive. In 2008, Zwei 2 would fail to meet sales expectations when it launched for the PC, and would go down as one of the worst performing titles in Falcom's history. Due to these changes in the market, and the company's continued positive sales on the PSP, Falcom started to move away from PC development. The PSP was becoming Falcom's primary development platform, with Vantage Master Portable and Brandish Dark Revenant releasing exclusively for the handheld in 2008 and 9. Neither of these remakes received any kind of PC release, which had not happened with a Falcom title since the company's fling with console development in the 90s. Even Nihon Falcom's next installment in the Ys franchise, Ys 7, would be developed for the PlayStation Portable instead of the PC. Finally, the fourth entry in the Trails franchise, Zero no Kiseki, would also be developed for the PSP, and wouldn't receive a PC port directly from Falcom until 2013, which would end up being the last PC game to ever be produced by the company. With Falcom moving away from PC development, the types of games they were making changed slightly as well, thanks to a change in target demographics. The average age of Falcom's PC fans were in their 30s and 40s, while the average player on the PSP was in their mid-teens and 20s. To appeal to this new demographic, Falcom began tweaking their games slightly to appeal to their new audience, such as their games featuring more modern art styles, with illustrator Katsumi Inami being responsible for the character designs for many of their titles during this period. However, while there was a clear change, the company remained true to their original spirit, with their focus on classic game design and crafting charming worlds. Their new focus on handheld development also allowed for more of their titles to be localized, with Xseed Games announcing in May 2010 that they would be releasing many of their PSP titles in North America, with the beginning of a partnership that would last for many years. As mentioned before, various Falcom titles had been released sporadically in the West over the course of its lifetime, but very few titles directly developed by Falcom ever made it overseas due to many of their games being developed for the PC. While the PC is a thriving platform today, thanks to online stores like Steam and GOG, during the early 2000s there were pretty much no Japanese PC games making it to the Western market. So having Falcom's games on a more internationally accessible platform like the PSP opened the gates for their games to be released around the world. This was the beginning of the modern era of Falcom, with this change in direction forming the company into what they are known as today. While they left behind a symbol of their past, it allowed them to move on to greater successes. After this is the modern history of Nihon Falcom that most fans are familiar with. Falcom would continue to mainly develop their popular Legend of Heroes and Ys franchises, often cycling between the two series every 3 years or so. Eventually they would shift development platforms from the PSP to the PlayStation Vita and PlayStation 3 for a time, and currently they solely make games for the PlayStation 4, with other companies helping them port their titles to other platforms. Over time, their titles have become even more successful, with the company announcing in 2018 that Ys 8 had sold over 500,000 copies worldwide, and that the Trails series had reached over 5 million copies sold in 2020. While that might be small potatoes compared to franchises that sell in the tens of millions, it is clear that Falcom's niche following is slowly growing. For Western fans that are aware of the studio, Nihon Falcom is a cool little company that makes fun RPGs, with some even erroneously calling them an indie developer. In reality, Falcom is one of the old ones, a developer that helped to define the Japanese role-playing genre along with other titans of the industry, like Square and Enix. However, due to their games primarily remaining on domestic PCs, and their company being cut off at the knees in the 80s just as they were beginning to grow, Falcom is almost never portrayed that way in the larger gaming narrative. While they are technically a shadow of the power they once wielded in their prime, Falcom remains a charming studio whose games often punch above their weight, rising above the smaller budgets that their developers work with to create truly memorable experiences. While their conservative business practices have stilted their growth at times, and even lost them employees in the past, they remain a staple of the RPG landscape, thanks to the consistent quality of their games. Their titles are growing in popularity, and surely they will continue to make games far into the future, because just as the heroes of their stories go on never-ending adventures, hopefully so too will Falcom's history be endless.